Hello everybody, thank you for tuning in. My name is Coach Pav and today I'm going to be discussing how you can accurately gauge your cycling performance improvements. Functional threshold power, FTP. It's been probably the gold standard for many years of training with power. Functional threshold heart rate being the heart rate equivalent. I hear an awful lot of chat around, everybody's FTP. It's, cafe stops are the worst, aren't they? Comparisons, watts per kilo, stuff like that. I welcome a shift away from FTP as a measure of performance improvements. Not entirely, but I definitely think we can get a bit more relevant and a bit more accurate, and I'm going to go through those points in this video. So first of all, FTP is fairly important. Now, there's two real main reasons why it is important. The first being that you're probably using a system, platform, maybe Training Peaks, Pillar, Zwift. I believe they all pretty much run on FTP. So if you have an inaccurate FTP amount figure within your settings on that platform you use, and then you do a session which is prescribed as a percentage of FTP, be that specifically or in zones, you're probably training in the complete wrong area. So yes, FTP is pretty important to make sure that if you're using some software, a platform, that you are training accurately, because that's the way that platform works. I again welcome platforms to start to open that up. I think the Sufferfest, I'm not really into that, nothing against it. I don't train indoors myself, and that my clients don't typically gravitate towards that. Their 4DP is a lot better using a critical power model, something like that will open up a lot more specificity and an awful lot more potential improvement from our training when we stop looking at basing all training based on FTP. Because simply when you start to go above FTP becomes super irrelevant around actually why you would set that. People's VO2 max zone honestly is very different across the board. It's so hard to estimate that from percentage of FTP. The problem is unless you have, you can estimate that with different tests, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but the most accurate way to do that is with a lot of equipment, which we just don't typically have in our homes. Once you even go higher than that, your sprints, I can't tell you, seriously, one of my biggest frustrations around Training Peaks is that you need to plan in in order to when you're looking at a big picture of someone's training, having a estimation of around what people are going to be sprinting needs to be in there. But obviously then you need to make sure that the client, my athlete understands that actually the prescribed sprint amount is an estimation, and they should just go all out. Like a 5-second sprint, you shouldn't really be looking at your power, not the first time. You should be going for it, and probably thereafter as well. You analyze your power after. If you're staring down at your Garmin during a sprint that's like 5 seconds or a peak sprint, you're probably not doing the best in your sprint. So finally as well, I know that we used to do a lot of 20-minute tests to estimate our FTP. Now, for those that aren't too familiar, 20 minutes, your average power for that, 95% would be a reflection estimation of your FTP. And remember that functional threshold power is simply an estimation of what you can hold for an hour. So already you're doing estimation of an estimation to get that amount. That's such a big coefficient of error already that it just makes it so impractical to prescribe all your training to train solely to FTP, that you need to just give yourself a break from worrying about what that number is. And the only reason, like I say, is to be making sure you're accurate, you have an accurate FTP, is because the platform that you're using probably runs on FTP. Hopefully in the future we will see platforms start to open up a little bit more. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to talk about my top 5 tips at the end of this video for what a test should be. but I'm going to go through some of the most common ones, mainly because they're going to mirror a lot of intensities, but also because there's going to be people that are listening to this and want, have different goals. So your test should be relatable to your goal. Like, there should be some main tests that you're doing. So for example, if you're a sprinter, you should at some point be testing, and I'm sure you are, you might not have it formally, but you will be testing, or you should be testing your sprint power. Now that could be over different durations. You should definitely be able to understand what your peak is at any point. And then, of course, you could probably work out exactly how long you need to sprint based on your competitors more than anything, and types of courses that you might need, so that you can understand what your sprint strength is, because some people, are much better over a short period of time, and others are, able to hold lesser power over a longer period of time, maybe by being more aero, thinking kind of like Cav here, if you were to remember, how Cav sprints is not necessarily the highest power, but that guy can do it for a longer period of time, and he's super slippery, so you see how low he gets, and that's where his ability comes from. I mean, it's still phenomenal amounts of power, right, but potentially less than some of his competitors. So if you're targeting hill climbs, I love this, because you could probably, if you're in the UK, going to be maybe sort of 3 to 8 minutes. You might have something shorter, but if say it's around that, probably, training that VO2 max. Now, short of having all of the face mask and all of that, there's not going to be a super accurate way of doing this, but I love like a 3-minute test as a good base for figuring out what your power could be around that sort of maximum minute power. But honestly, if you are targeting a specific climb, which most people are, you could use Strava, or you could just go out, ride that hill and set a benchmark power. That's like the best way to do it. If you've got like a hill that you want to do, like even in your Sportive or Gran Fondo, if you can do the hill that's that's in your mind the most, or all of them, and you can work out exactly what that power is, you can train around that power at that duration. You might break it into intervals and stuff like that, but you're going to have a great baseline for you to work up from. And then over a period of 9 months of training for this event, you're going to have a lot of stuff where you can benchmark and see those improvements. And of course, you could then start to train if you've got that power, especially if it's a shorter climb. You're going to know roughly that bracket of where you can train to do like a bit over, a bit under. Similarly, setting sessions, as I talked about with sprints before, setting your sessions as sprint as percentage of peak power is so much better than FTP, and it's the same for hill climbing. So make sure that when you're looking at your individual training and you're setting your intensity, you're not worrying about what it is as percentage of FTP, even if you are setting it on training peaks, which is what I do with my clients. Has to come through as percentage of FTP, but often I'm not looking at that, and that's what you should be doing too. You should be getting that number, the end number, to match what you should be training at, and then it's going to give you a percentage of FTP, because that's what we have to use. All right, so if you're still doing time trials, love time trials, right? It's my bread and butter when I was living in the UK. Honestly, for me, the best test is a 20-minute test, just because you're probably hoping to get around that time if you're doing a 10 mile time trial. But B, it's just that steady state, effort, the mental capacity, the strength to be able to complete that is going to work really well as you start to look towards doing some time trials. So that, I recommend, that is probably the most specific test. And if you aren't at that kind of range where you want to do time trials, like that is where percentage of FTP can actually be pretty good. You're going to start to understand from the differences in the distances that you want to target what your percentage of FTP you might train in order to see benefits from that. It's quite different. There's so many different time trials. So, that's where you just need to experiment a little bit and figure out. You've got old data. Old data is perfect. If you're new to time trials, you can ask some friends what their percentages might be between, what their power is on a 10 to 25 to 50 to 100 to 12 or 24 hour. And you're probably watching this, you are most likely a Gran Fondo or Sportive rider. It's typically who I track, because it's typically who I love to work with the most. Not that I don't love working with everybody, but I do specialize in that area. The best test for an endurance event that is like that is, building up towards that. It can be as simple as jumping on your bike, understanding that the demand of your event is 8 hours maybe, and then can you ride your bike that long and towards that. You could start to get complicated or a little bit more complicated and looking at your efficiency, your aerobic efficiency. So that might be the point at which your heart rate starts to deviate from your power, or your power from your heart rate. One of the two will always drift off as you get into endurance. If it's not, you're probably not going hard or long enough. So that can be a good marker of how you could boost that training. But ultimately, what you want to see is your body being able to cope with riding that longer. And that is the best test for endurance. Now, all of those tests, you're probably going to be doing something that you could look at every week. But you don't need to do a formal test every week. A formal test I love to put in, you might do one every 4 weeks, might be every 8 weeks during your easier weeks. It could be, a lot of people, I love to make sure there is some intensity in the easier weeks, just because most people will feel a lot better when they go back into their build, having had a little bit. It's definitely not a lot of intensity. So your test might make that up. But similarly, you don't need to worry about doing it with power meters and stuff like this. You can visualize, week on week improvements, just understanding that as you get through, if you're doing a 3-week build period, you might see improvement week 1 and week 2, but week 3, you're probably getting a bit tired. So if you don't improve on that week, that's not the end of the world. Take your recovery week and then get back on after that. So coming to the end of this, I'm going to wrap up with my top tips for your testing. So number 1, like I said, relevance. Now, of course, you're going to do some FTP tests during your year to make sure you've got that right, so your platform's not wrong and your training is not wrong. But make sure that your most important test is the one that is most relevant to your event. So like I say, if you are doing an endurance event, you will make sure that you do some endurance events before, and that's why we might have B or C goals before your A goal, which is your most important goal of the year, to test that out. But similarly, you should be progressing slightly week in week, month on month. That endurance, how long you're on the bike, that's a great example. Okay, so it's got to be repeatable. This is where a lot of people go wrong, trying to do some testing outdoors and stuff like that. And I know I said that going out and doing your hill climb test on that hill is really important. You are going to lose a little bit of the repeatability by doing that, but ultimately you're probably still better off because it's so specific. If you've got a hill, if you want to do a hill climb time trial, go and test yourself on that hill. It's the most specific. Just make sure you note down anything that could stop it being repeatable. Now, on a hill climb, you might not be affected too much by wind and weather, but you're probably on open roads. So if there's a vehicle that's slowing you down, maybe there's other cyclists, you need to make sure that you note that, so that next time you're not thinking that you're just miles ahead or there was something down. So repeatability is really important, as is controlling your environment. So again, really hard outside. So that's why most of your testing is probably going to be indoors. Again, for our endurance Sportive Gran Fondo riders, don't worry about doing that indoors. It's not specific enough because you're going to be riding outdoors. But for our testers, you're probably better off staying indoors. 20 minutes, as you know, is going to get interrupted. So indoors, control that environment, but just make an understanding based on your data whether or not there is a difference between your indoors and outside power, because there almost certainly is. It might be something small, but I've worked with athletes that see 10 to 20% difference. Crazy amount. It could just be power meters, but it could literally be they're just much better and more comfortable outside. Of course, talking about power meters, you've got to make sure your data is accurate, people. So make sure that everything is set up correctly, and definitely zero offset or calibrate your power meter as per the manufacturer recommendations. If you don't do that, especially if you forget over a long period of time, your data is garbage. It's not going to be relevant. I've worked with clients and athletes who tell me that for a whole season they didn't calibrate or zero offset their power meter, and that was the season they were the best on the bike. And I'm not saying that they weren't the best on their bike, but when you start to get to the next season and you've realised that you're calibrating your power meter, you can't get your power anywhere near it. Unfortunately, that's because your data isn't accurate from the time before. And the final most important point here is test all your process goals. Now, if you've watched my video on goal setting and stuff like that, I place a massive amount of emphasis on the complete holistic cyclist. Every event has demands. Every demand you can test. So, for example, you might be able to ride a bike for 8 hours, but can you hold the position? Can you hold the position of, effectively enough to climb a hill efficiently? What about descending? Are you going to be that guy, a person that loses all the time descending? Can you ride in a group? Can you stay low enough on the bars to be aerodynamic? All of these are great. I mean, for flexibility, aside from being on the bike, you could do some, core work and just hold the plank, and that's a great way. Every 4 weeks, see how long you can hold a plank, and then you'll know if your core and flexibility stuff is helping or not. Similarly, with like leg strength training, if you want to build up some strength in the gym, doing a standing jump, either vertically or horizontally, can be a good test to see whether that is working or not. But write down every demand of your event. Super easy. Check out my video if you've not seen it. It's going to help you massively work out what you need to do, and then that way you're going to be able to turn yourself into a total complete holistic cyclist, and you're going to have the testing to make sure you are improving. So that is it. Thank you so much for watching. As ever, I've referenced quite a few different bits of my content throughout this video. If you're on my website, you'll find it all below in the blog. And if you're on my YouTube channel, I will link everything in the description. If it says coming soon, it's coming soon, I promise. And make sure share this with your friends. Sharing is caring. Make sure you give me a thumbs up, leave me a comment, reach out, email me, whatever it is. I love hearing from you all. Similarly, 15-minute consultations are always free, so feel free to reach out if you want to have a chat about your training. And that is it. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Coach Pav. Have an awesome day.